Miguel Anxo Bastos Bubeta, titular do Departamento.
Miguel Anxo Bastos Balbetta, Head of the Department of Political Science and Administration here at the Faculty of Political Sciences, is a prominent member of the Juan de Mariana Institute. Renowned anarcho-capitalist, he teaches the subject of public policies. But just as there are people who study ticks to exterminate them, Professor Bastos does the same with state policies. Today, Professor Bastos will speak to us about what makes a country prosperous, and I can try to make a good summary of his speech in 4 words: capitalism, savings, and hard work.
Falarei o que me apeteça, como bom anarquista que son.
So, I'll talk about what I want, as the good anarchist that I am. I'll talk for a while, I'll explain what my visions are regarding a free country, what a prosperous country should look like, how it should work. My first idea was to debate about secession and the independence of Galicia, which, as you well know, I defend, as a topic to warm up. But they convinced me that, for the first day, it was too much. So, let's talk about the prosperity of a nation, from which I do not exclude the idea of secession. For me, it is a very important idea if we want to achieve the prosperity of a nation. But let's talk strictly about what makes a country rich or poor. What always needs to be explained first is wealth, not poverty. Poverty is the natural condition of human beings. Human beings lived for tens of thousands of years, in caves, in huts, getting wet in the rain, dying of cold, dying of all kinds of pests, with a very low life expectancy, poorly nourished, with enormous pain, deaths in childbirth, deaths simply from breaking a leg, or things like that. That is, human life has always been a very long suffering life. And it was like that throughout history. And it was like that in most of the geographic areas of planet Earth. What needs to be explained is why in some areas people began to prosper and to enjoy, more or less, the relative opulence that we enjoy today. To be well nourished, to be more or less well dressed, not to die of cold, to have some kind of shelter, to have means of transportation, means of telecommunications, health, and so on, that allow us to live a long and prosperous life. How is that explained? That is the European miracle. It is the miracle of capitalism. It is the miracle that must be explained. Because I repeat, human history has always been stagnant. The standard of living from the Roman Empire to the 18th century has been stable. It didn't improve much. All over the world, not only here. In fact, many areas of the world were richer than Europe before the Industrial Revolution. Europe only surpasses China in the 14th or 15th century. But, more or less, they were always even. What explains this? It's a phenomenon that occurs in some countries on Earth, in Europe, in North America, and some Central European countries. A process of capital accumulation. A process called the Industrial Revolution, the Capitalist Revolution, which then spreads to the rest of the world like an oil stain. It first appears in small places, and then expanded in such a way that now, little by little, it is slowly expanding to almost the entire Earth. In fact, the last step is slowly being achieved, which is the development, finally, of Africa. The fastest growing countries in the world today, if we can use quantitative measures, are the Africans. And that is because, once the process has started, it's easier to develop. The first countries took about 150 years to develop, and the last countries that are developing in Southeast Asia, I'm thinking of South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, the Chinese miracle, the miracle of certain areas of India, I'm thinking of some African countries like Botswana that are growing at very high rates. That's what needs to be explained. Those countries are now developing in 35 to 40 years. For us, it took 150 years. Why? Because of the advantages of coming second. Because those countries are now starting with the existing capital provided by other countries that help or lend capital to those new countries. Why is it miraculous then? Because the first countries that developed, Great Britain, the United States, and I think France and Germany, had no one to help them. They didn't have any European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They didn't have any World Bank. They didn't have any soft credit to help them develop from the outside. They had to get out of poverty on their own. And how did they do it? That's the thing. How did they do it? Due to 2 factors. Capitalization and the capitalist means of allocating that capital. What I just said may seem very redundant. By the first, capitalization, I mean that a society that wants to develop must have savings. You must have some kind of savings that allows you to finance capital goods. Many of you already know the mythical example, which I always mention, of Robinson and the coconuts, which is always good to know. Imagine Robinson. I know it is a very commonly used example, but I never tire of repeating it, especially for people who don't know it. Imagine Robinson, who is alone on an island. He has nothing. He is alone with his hands. He has nothing. He is alone. And every day he must get 10 coconuts to eat. And every day he gets 10 coconuts. Every day he eats 10 coconuts. And every day, day after day, day after day. One day, an idea occurs to him. If he had a stick with a net, he could cast it from below and capture the coconuts much more comfortably and could capture more. He asks himself, how much do I need to have that stick? To have a stick, I need to go to the other end of the island. I need to make a rope, a net, and make the tool. And he calculates, how much do I need to make that stick? I need a day. Then Robinson thinks, I can't spend a whole day eating the coconuts without working to get more. So he abandons the idea. But the next day it occurs to him, wait, every day I get 10 coconuts, so I can do two things. Of the 10 coconuts, I eat 9 and save 1, or I work 1 hour more, produce 11 coconuts and save 1. And so he does. And after 10 days, what does he have? He has 10 coconuts. And if he has 10 coconuts, what can he do? He can finance the production of the stick. And the moment he has the stick, what happens? How many coconuts does he produce each day? 30. We are rich because we don't work with our hands. We work with tractors. John Deere, Massey Ferguson. We work with computers, with machine tools, with trucks, locomotives, railways, power plants, gas plants, nuclear power plants. We have powerful infrastructure. Automobiles, all kinds of telecommunication tools that require satellites to communicate. How is that built? The same way Robinson built his stick, with the savings of our ancestors. Our ancestors had to sacrifice part of their consumption to finance, little by little, small capital goods, which cumulatively we have got. Our ancestors built bridges, our ancestors built roads, built rudimentary ploughs, fed animals like oxen and so on, which are small capital goods. And they built all kinds of small tools with very hard effort. Because remember one thing, when they say that we are rich and others are poor, we all come from the caves, all of us. Blacks, whites, Chinese, Indians, men and women, we all come from caves. There are no races or people that are better than others. We are all human beings, but we all come from the same place. What needs to be explained is why some succeeded and others did not, because some always capitalize and others don't. So the root of wealth is capitalization. We are not richer than a citizen, for example, from Zimbabwe because we are more handsome or whiter. We are equal. We are human beings, all the same. What is the difference between us and them? That we work with capital goods. And unfortunately, Africans work with less productive capital goods. Simply that. There is no more magic than that. What needs to be explained is how we obtain those capital goods. Those capital goods were obtained, basically, through savings. Why do some cultures save more money than others? And some towns and some people are thriftier than others? There are many explanations, and that is the key to development. The first key to development, you must have savings. Not all cultures are equally thrifty. Some theorists, some anthropologists, point to the idea that, for example, in the northern towns, in coal towns, land is not arable all year round. There isn't food in every month of the year. But the people who live in the north of the world, in the northern hemisphere, they would spend a few months in which there was food for cultivation, and a few months of cold in which they had to live sheltered, live off that year's reserves. So those people, since they lived in a cold climate, they had to get used to having some type of housing or something of long duration of a certain quality, precisely to be able to survive all that time. And they had to get used to two things. One, not to eat all the corn, all the wheat, all the rye, or all the barley they grew in the summer months, and store corn, rye, barley, so that it could last the 4, 5, or 6 months of winter. In other words, that money, those coconuts, were not eaten. It was saved so that it would last the rest of the year. And not only that, but another part also had to be saved for next year's seed. Some anthropologists say that these kinds of customs in some towns gave the idea of saving, capitalizing for the future. We must add a series of factors to this. This type of saving is a saving for survival. When I talk about savings, I'm talking about capitalization savings. Capitalization savings, the savings that are used to finance things, requires sacrificing immediate consumption, like Robinson, in order to obtain future consumption in the medium or long term. And that requires a cultural vision. When I sometimes, and we can discuss it later in the debate, talk about poverty or wealth, I'm not referring to either having assets or not having them, but as an attitude towards the world, as an attitude towards money. That is, for me, capitalism is culture, it is values. Not all people have them. I repeat, nor are some people better than others. Having some values or others is about morality. Now, if you ask me, how can I be rich? If you want to be rich, you must follow these principles. If you don't want to, that's your right, it's your life. But if you are poor, don't complain later. Poverty and wealth have a lot to do, and much more than you think, with values, with mental, moral, cultural values, and so on. And what are the values that allow capitalization? The idea of time preference. The idea that immediate pleasure must be sacrificed in part to obtain future pleasures. How is that achieved? For example, with institutions such as private property. Some authors say that private property is vital. Private property is vital for capitalization. Some kind of private property. There are many kinds of private property. The property that we use to study at the Faculty of Law, the property of the Roman Empire, modern corporate property. There are many kinds of private property, but there must be some kind of stable property. I consider that private property is currently very undervalued, but still, it is a more or less attenuated property which allows, in a certain way, this capitalization. Why? Because if you have private property, you have an incentive to save, to capitalize, to improve your productivity, and you have direct incentive to improve your own production. So private property is an indirect factor of capitalization, in the sense that it leads people to save. To try to improve your house, improve your tools, improve your livestock, improve your tractor, depreciate tractor parts when they wear out, and so on. You must have a mentality like that. So ownership is an important factor. Then there are cultural factors, even for example religious values of a moral nature or things like that, in the sense of repression. Old Freud, and this is also very controversial, said that civilization is a repression of instincts. And this is true. The person, if he wants to capitalize, must suppress his instincts. The instincts, for example, of use, the instincts of pleasure, immediate pleasure, repress them to have more tomorrow. In other words, don't spend all the money. Maybe I have money and I say, we're going to spend it all on a drunken spree, or we're going to spend it all buying expensive clothes. Don't spend everything. Put it in the piggy bank and save. And that money, over time, will be capitalized and will allow you to live better. But they are moral values in the sense that they reject the ideology, the disastrous principle of carpe diem, of the damn carpe diem, of the damn idea of living in the moment. Because ideas like those are the ones that lead a society not to capitalize, but to decapitalize. It is a mistake to say that capitalism is created with consumerism. And people identify capitalism with expensive cars, with very glamorous gentlemen on beaches drinking daiquiris and things like that. Living life and stuff like that, going to nightclubs and so on. Things like this, having a good time. Dancing in the discos. It is understood that way. No. Capitalism is savings, it is sacrifice, it is not spending. Don't spend now to have more tomorrow. But there is the idea that the capitalist is all about luxuries and shopping centres. No. Capitalism is Victorian. Why was it born in England and not somewhere else? What did the Victorians have? It was a hugely repressive society and enormously greedy. I mean, they spent little, they had no vices, vices were frowned upon. It was a very repressive society, culturally, which I repeat is neither good nor bad. In this repressive culture, people repress their instincts and save money to be able to finance assets. The Victorian capitalist lived on the interests of the interests. If he had £1,000, that £1,000 was loaned out for £100. He lived with £10. £1,000 earned £100. £100 was loaned out for another £10. He lived with the £10 earned, and the rest for the principal amount. But every 7 years, that person doubled their standard of living, without touching the principal amount. And that capital was invested long-term in building factories, railways, infrastructure. Those savings were what allowed all those things to be financed. If they weren't so greedy, if they didn't think about the future and with these tools, we would never get out of misery. If we consumed everything we have, if we spend everything we have, how do we finance roads? How do we finance infrastructure? How do we finance gas plants? How do we finance satellites? It would be impossible. If we ate everything, we would be like Robinson, eating all the coconuts. We would never get out of poverty. Robinson comes out of poverty when he sacrifices part of his consumption and capitalizes it. In other words, he invests it in a capitalist way. Robinson could also have been investing those coconuts by spending a day lazing around at the beach. Yes or no? Yes, and he would spend a day of pleasure without working. But if he spent that day without working, consuming those coconuts, happy with his daiquiri on the beach, he would never get out of poverty. Robinson only gets out of poverty when he saves, and when he saves that money through capitalist means. So, what are the influences? All cultural values. For example, if a religion, it's the old Max Weber debate, favours accumulation more than another. I think that Catholicism is one of the religions that allows the most accumulation. Hayek said that too. This does not mean that everyone cannot live as they want. I'm just saying that certain kinds of family, certain ways of life favour capitalization. Curiously, those are the ways of life that we had. Some social and political stability also helps. I mean, if a society is always in civil wars, is always fighting, if property is insecure, either for politics, because there are revolutions, or because there are wrong economic policies, those societies would have no incentive to save. When we talk about the importance of low taxes and so on, it is not because low taxes are in themselves good or bad, but because low taxes encourage investment, because they free up part of our income so that it can be capitalized. High taxes transform capital spending into current consumption expenditure. The higher the tax, the less incentive there is to save, and therefore there is less incentive to capitalize. And if a society is not capitalized, it becomes poorer. If a company is not capitalized, its economy declines. And if a company is capitalized, that is, we have more and more capital goods, its economy improves. Many of those capital goods are intangible. All of you have mobile phones. You don't give them any importance, but you have a mobile phone with which you can communicate with any point on Earth in a matter of seconds, and for very little money, in some cases free. You don't see that there is any capital, but in order to do that, there must be satellites. There must be a huge telecommunications network and so on. But that is what allows us to communicate. Someone saved in order to finance a satellite that allows us to telecommunicate with any part of the Earth. So, all those cultural, religious, political factors are important. There are even debates on whether the monarchy or the republic favour one thing or another more. Which of the two types of government favours capitalisation more? What religion or what forms of conduct favour capitalisation more? I only know that it is cultural. I know that they are values. And I know that wealth and poverty depend a lot on values. The proof, as I always discuss many times in classes, is every year in Spain or Europe, several hundred people win the lottery. There are like 200 or 300 people every year who win more than 1 million euros in the lottery, in the whole of Europe. That is known from statistics. Those rich people who have an enormous fortune could live well all their lives if they invested well and didn't touch the principal amount. 3/4 or 3/5 of them end up in poverty in less than 4 years. Why? Because they don't have money? No, they have a lot. It is because they do not have this vision of time. Because as soon as they see the money, they quickly spend it. The principal amount, which has to be sacred and untouched, like the Victorians did, they immediately spend it, usually in unproductive expenses or expenses that, economically, are quite counterproductive, like buying very expensive cars, which is the thing that depreciates the most, clothes, which is one of the things that depreciates the most, and so on. So, is it just a matter of money? There are humble people to whom fortunes fall to, and why do they end up poor again? Because they didn't have money? Because they didn't have opportunities? No, it is because wealth or poverty at an individual level and at a global level, global wealth depends on individual wealth, is determined by different visions of time. And that is why, for me, it is so important, and I always emphasize, even though they insult me, that if a society wants to be prosperous, it has to be thrifty. They always have to spend less than they earn, and save and invest. Because that is what will allow us, to you and to us, to always have a job and be increasingly richer. That's the only way. Capitalize. Now, capitalization alone is not enough. In advanced societies like ours, and here comes the second part of the speech, with capitalization, just accumulating a lot of coconuts is not enough. Those coconuts have to be properly invested. And that is another great civilizational advance that occurred in the West, but also in many cultures. The idea of creating institutions to correctly channel that credit to the best possible uses. I mean, Robinson has the coconuts, he can finance the stick. But what if Robinson is wrong and instead of a stick, he finances an iron machete? An iron machete is not financed in a day. An iron machete would take, hypothetically, for example, 3 months to make. What if Robinson is wrong, and he starts making a machete instead of a stick? What would happen to him? That would consume capital in the wrong way. And what would happen to him? He would run out of coconuts, and he would be left without a machete. Why? Because he didn't calculate correctly. So it is very important not only to accumulate savings. It's not just about saving. Those savings have to be correctly invested, at all times, in the most appropriate use. And how do you achieve that? With institutions that human beings created in many cultures around the world. Many of them, for example, were invented by the Chinese. Others were invented by the Arabs. Others were invented in northern Italy in the times of the Renaissance. They are all capitalist institutions. For example, double accounting. That's a great invention. It is an invention of Catholic origin, in the sense that it was created in a Catholic country, in medieval Italy. The stock markets, the financial markets, insurance companies, which allowed freights to be insured, money, bills of exchange, all kinds of payment, accounting that allows us to know costs and benefits. All those kinds of things allow us to buy, sell, and invest our hard-earned savings from deprived consumption at any time in the best possible uses. How is that measured? Well, with interest rates, profit rates. Interest rates tell us how much we will earn from an investment. Profits tell us, invest here, go there. Losses tell us, get away from there, that doesn't work. And so capital is always flowing at all times from the least productive sectors to the most productive ones. The necessary investment is always correctly calculated, that is, in such a way that Robinson does not make a mistake. Only the investments that can be financed are financed. For example, interest rates are vital. Interest rates are a market mechanism, a central price. What do interest rates tell us? A high interest rate, what does it tell us? There is no capital. That is, if I wanted to finance a new tractor, if I wanted to finance a gas plant, there is no capital. How do I know there isn't? By looking at the interest rate, by seeing it is expensive. Can the return on your investment beat that interest rate? If you can beat it, yes. If you can't, no. Your gas plant is not a priority. And why do I know it is not a priority? Because it doesn't beat the interest rate. And how do I know it is scarce? Because the interest rate is high. And if an interest rate is low, I would say capital is abundant. It's time to buy a tractor. It's time to buy a new machine. It's time to expand my factory. Why do I know that? Because the interest rate is low. Profits, losses, stock markets, financial markets, the reviled futures markets, the idea of betting on the future, are institutions, human creations that allow us to channel that credit every moment to the best possible use. Those two things together are what allowed us to create a prosperous country. If we have those institutions, if we have a savings culture, if we have a work culture, if we have a social and individual culture, I don't believe in groups. Both in practice and conceptually, I do not believe in groups. Each one of you, if you do this, will tend to prosper. And if each one of us does this, society will prosper. There is no other alternative. If there is another one, tell me. Some Marxists speak of the primitive accumulation of capital. That can't exist. They say, we plundered America's gold and those kinds of things. Yes, but as far as I know, gold is not capital. Gold is a medium of exchange. Gold doesn't produce goods. If you introduce gold, you raise prices, but you don't create new factories. It would be wonderful to see capital be produced out of a piece of metal. It isn't. What gold does is to distribute existing capital in a different way. That is, if before that capital was dedicated to making chairs and someone arrives with gold, now, instead of making chairs, that scarce capital is going to be dedicated to manufacturing lamps, or it is going to be dedicated to manufacturing car wheels. Simply put, gold is used to distribute capital, but it does not create new capital. It cannot create new capital. If not, Genghis Khan, with all the gold he looted from the Romans, would have gotten rich, and he didn't. And the problem is that they say that colonialism and these things were created like this. No. Name a single European country that collapsed after losing its colonies. Not a single European country collapsed after losing its colonies. For example, when Spain lost its colonies, treasury bills grew like never before, because the colonies, and the classical liberals knew that very well, are a millstone hung around the neck. Unlike Marx, for example, who defended imperialism in India, it is written down. Marx argued that capitalism was a progressive, productive force. Therefore, capitalism had to be brought to India to make India progress, so that India would become capitalist and, later, be led to socialism. Opposite to Marxists who defend imperialism, the free traders, Cobden, Bright, the so-called Manchester liberalism, they always opposed imperialism furiously and fiercely, because imperialism is the worst thing. Imperialism cannot create wealth. So some say that capitalism is born from there, of a kind of original accumulation of capital. But nothing can come out of that gold. In fact, the accumulation of gold in Spain was worthless. Spain, after accumulating enormous amounts of gold, went bankrupt 4 or 5 times. The first was with Philip II, as soon as he came to power. With all the gold in the world, it went bankrupt several times. The gold was worthless. And countries that never had colonies like Switzerland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Norway, and so on, where did they get the original wealth to develop? Many of them started without that. It is an explanation that is given. I don't know what alternative explanation can be made. It is always said that we got rich, that capitalism grew, by plundering the Third World. Yes, there was plundering in the Third World. Yes, there was, it cannot be denied. But, of course, wealth does not derive from that plunder. It is an imperial plunder, a criminal plunder. A plunder like the one Belgium did in the Congo and so on. They are criminal plunders, absolutely barbaric, but that is not the cause of wealth. Otherwise, Portugal would be incredibly rich. Portugal was the country that had, proportionally, the largest colonies and for the longest periods of time, and it was of little use to them, because colonies are not worth it. I'm trying to mention other explanations that are given. Explanations about being rich as a result of plundering by taking from others, or about previous appropriation. The explanation I give is this one. And why is it not convincing? Because it's hard. It says that if we want to be rich, we have to work. If we want to be rich, we have to save. If we want to be rich, we have to have institutions that channel credit. There is no other way to do it. And there are no shortcuts. And it is getting easier each time, because now there is a sufficient level of capital. A Russian economist named Gershenchron explained the advantage of coming second. And it is true, that is, the countries that are now developing already have a stock of capital that other countries created. They already have technologies developed in other countries. They don't have to start from scratch. These are the advantages of coming second. They simply adopt the technologies recently achieved in the first world. That is, they go directly to the mobile phone. They go directly to the electric railway. They don't run steam railroads or push-button telephones. They go straight to the latest technology. They skip those stages and, above all, they have capital that allows them to finance their development. The first country to develop had to start with their previous savings. They used the savings of other people, which were lent to them, and with that they were able to capitalize. This is how we see the development of Singapore, the development even of China, the spectacular development that India is undergoing, if they don't stop it. This development is derived from the existence of capital of other countries. They didn't have to spend the 140 to 150 years that we had to go through, which was slow and difficult, with very hard work in the factories, with very hard work in the mines, with child labour, with all kinds of things. But it was what allowed us to slowly develop. And that, and only that, is what allows our children, elderly, and ill people to not have to work, thanks to that capital endowment. If not, we would have to go back to ancient societies. So, capitalism and prosperity are that. Savings, work, and capitalism. Capitalist ways of allocating resources. What happens in your fable when Robinson, due to the enormous efficiency of that long stick, with a rope or whatever, consumes all those coconuts on the island? And, in line with this, what happens when the great international capitalists of the world today end all cheap fossil fuels which are used to move goods, produce them, or to put those satellites in the sky, to dematerialize this economy of the West that has already progressed? Okay, if I touched on the subject of private property before, it was because if Robinson owns the coconuts, he has an incentive not to exhaust the coconut system. Jared Diamond, for example, in Collapse, talks about the collapse of Easter Island. Maybe you were thinking about that book, because the Easter people did not have privately owned institutions. They cut down the trees and did not replace the trees. My grandfather, when he cut down a tree, planted another, so that the capital, the land, would not lose value. And furthermore, even if you wanted to mortgage or sell that land was worth more with a planted tree than if it didn't have one. If Robinson knows about private property, he'd know that if he consumes all the coconuts, he will be left without coconuts. Therefore, he has to build up stock. He has to manage those coconuts efficiently. But I'm more interested in the second question you asked me, about cheap energy. Energy has never been cheaper than today. And we have never had more resources than today. The ancients only had stones as resources, or they had firewood. In the 18th century, they had firewood and coal. Now you have firewood, coal, oil, gas, sun, water, rain, wind, lithium, uranium, everything you can think of. You have more resources than ever, and in fact, energy is cheaper than ever, in real terms. You have to work fewer hours to have a unit of energy, and the proof is that we have light, we are warm, we have all kinds of goods. It It is more abundant, it is more powerful, and it's more stable than ever. So Robinson, if he is smart, he will use resources in a way that makes them last. The thing is that, since we live in an open society, we have increasingly more resources. Resources are something we make. And do you know what the resource is? Your powerful intelligence. Not the resource itself. The Indians of the Caribbean lived for thousands of years above oil lakes. Why didn't they set up Standard Oil? Why didn't they set up Shell? Because for them, oil was not a resource. It was something worthless. Because oil only had worth once Mr. Otto and Mr. Diesel invented internal combustion engines that require that type of fuel. Then that thing starts to matter. Before that, it was worthless. In fact, the Mongols, when they conquered Baghdad, they set fire to the oil wells to make them burn, to have fun at night. It is true. And it took years to turn off the fire. Because for them it was worthless. Nobody wanted it. Oil was a hindrance. When is oil valuable? When the human mind creates a use for it. And literally everything can potentially become a resource. A stone, hypothetically everything. In fact, we have more and more resources because we are expanding the range of resources. We went from having firewood to now having oil and so on. And we have more and more things. That is why our grandchildren will have more and more resources, not less. And later everything becomes cheaper. And they are used in a more efficient way. As I always tell you, if you invent a carburetor that consumes 10 times less, suddenly you have 10 times more oil. Not in physical terms, but in economic terms. Those are the ones that interest you. If you, for example, invent a pesticide, a new form of irrigation, or a transgenic seed, the same piece of land produces 4 times more. Therefore, you have 4 times more land, not less. Any invention of that kind, a pesticide, a form of irrigation, that multiplies the production of the land, immediately gives you 4 times more land. Not in physical terms, but in economic terms. Resources are becoming more abundant, not less, and the proof is in the prices. If you tell me something is running out, we should buy it. But well done for the question. Oil and gasoline are cheaper than ever today, in real terms. Well, that's okay, but then, how do you explain that large companies, BP, Shell, the other oil companies, and the companies of the energy sector have been in real trouble for 3 years, making mergers, buying smaller companies that are no longer efficient enough? Why? Oil is cheap because there was a very strong crisis that made global demand go down a lot. Much more in the countries that were richer, to the detriment of those that continue to grow at a more appropriate pace. But these issues in the real world mean that these companies are using their investments for new oil wells and, therefore, in the medium to long-term future, the supply of cheap energy is decreasing. Indeed, before we lived with firewood, now we live with gasoline. But we didn't switch to gasoline because we ran out of firewood. We did not invent the car because we ran out of horses. Therefore, if we run out of gasoline, what are we doing? By magic, will we suddenly invent nuclear fusion? No, but you have electric cars, you have steam cars. As you well know, when the car was invented, Edison asked Henry Ford why he bothered to make gasoline cars when the electric car is going to win. The gasoline car, the internal combustion car, always fought until the 1920s with the steam car. The steam car did not develop due to issues with technical efficiency, but basically, the steam engine is there and it can be made at any time. You won't be left without a car. I mean, you don't want a car, you want transportation. You want to go from your house to the city centre. And then we have the topic of why companies merge. Well, the reason for why companies merge is more complex. I believe that there are several factors in the oil crisis. 1. Obama's money. Obama's brutal credit expansion. Much of that money was dedicated to futures and investments in raw materials. The competition from fracking. and later geopolitical factors such as latent war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, in which Saudi Arabia wants to ruin Iran and is making prices hit rock bottom. There are several factors that Edelman explained very well in a book called Genie Out of the Bottle, explaining how most of the volatility in the oil sector is due to geopolitical factors. And it is due to political factors, war between blocs and trying to position themselves in the oil markets. But this volatility is not due to the shortage of oil, but because some countries trying to suddenly turn off the supply to drown another, or because there is a trade war between them. That is what explains the volatility. But the price of oil, discounting the volatility, it is slowly going down. And if it slowly goes down, it means that it is becoming more abundant. It's going down if you discount inflation and deduct taxes. Today, oil is cheaper than in the 1980s. Imagine that we go to the 19th century and, as Jevons said, we took charcoal away from the people of the 19th century. Jevons is an economist who said that coal was running out and that we had to ration coal. Imagine that we go to the 19th century and we take away from those people who were around 10 times poorer than us their charcoal and force them to be cold in order to save carbon for the future. Imagine that we do this, that we take coal from the poor to save coal, so that we have a lot of coal, which today is almost useless. We have more coal than ever. Coal in Nebraska, coal in Siberia, coal in South Africa. And what the hell is coal for? Why do we need so much coal if we are closing all the mines? And what's the point of preventing a poor person from the 19th century from using coal, considering coal is now worthless? Well, we are doing the same thing. We are depriving ourselves of consuming a resource that is abundant, such as oil, to save for a hypothetical grandson that won't use it. He's going to say, I have a gas car, or I have a nuclear-powered car. Why are you giving me that? What do I want that for? We'd deprive ourselves of something that our grandchildren, who are going to be 5 times richer than us, are not going to need and aren't going to thank us for. And we are depriving ourselves, getting cold in the winter and not consuming resources that our grandchildren will not want. The same as now we don't want the coal they saved. What the hell do we want that coal for? Which of you heats the kitchen with charcoal? Which of you showers with charcoal? Do your cars run on coal? What do you use charcoal for? Jevons saved coal and saved paper. He had a house full of paper because it was going to run out too. He said there was going to be no paper. Money is like a veil. It hides relationships from us. If you have to work, to make ends meet, you understand that to make ends meet, you have to save to finance your stick. And how do you finance your stick? With coconuts. Today, it is financed in the same way, with saved coconuts, and with saved consumer goods. But now, those saved consumer goods are expressed through a monetary veil, through money. So, we identify capital with money, and money is not capital. Money is a medium of exchange that reflects capital, but capital is something else. Capital is coconuts, machines. If now we burn all the bills on Earth, we would have communication problems, we would have exchange problems, but the capital endowment would remain intact. The factories would be there, the power plants would be there, the roads would still be there. If we burn all the gold, we burn all the bills, the capital endowment remains intact. Trucks, roads would still be there. Nothing would happen. We would have to invent something new. Bitcoin, some virtual currency, or something like that. But the capital endowment would not be affected by that. Monetary catastrophes cause damage, but they do not affect, in the shorter term, the capital structure. Who saves capital today? Companies, for example, when they don't consume everything they earn. This is explained by Peter Bauer in Descent on Development. When a company earns and reinvests part of what it earns, for example, in financing, is capitalizing. If you spend less than what you earn, you save. I can't save. I will save 4,000 euros in 10 years. And what do I do with 4,000 euros? You can save. 4,000 euros is enough for many things. You can, for example, invest in capital. You can finance a small car to start working. You can finance your first months when you start working somewhere. Of course, little amounts are very useful. Samuel Smiles, a Victorian, who is an author that I like a lot, emphasises a lot that anyone can save. And Samuel Smiles, in a book called Thrift, a beautiful book that of course nowadays is no longer read or edited, since today we are in a more modern carpe diem culture, he explained how, with small sums, a worker, for example, instead of drinking 2 beers, he can drink 1 every day. And the value of 1 beer per day capitalized allows you to ensure, for example, your family for all your life. Or it allows you to finance capital for a big pension if you start saving now. Smiles made a big emphasis on small savings. He mentioned, for example, the creation of the so-called cent banks. They were banks that were created in the Victorian economy, not for millions of pounds, nor for millions of euros, but for cents, so that each worker would get used to it. Each child would get used to putting in 2 or 3 cents that they had left over. The idea of the piggy bank. Those are ideas that we Galicians had before. Now, the Galician race has degenerated. Those savings are what helped us capitalize because it creates a culture of savings. The key is that you always have to live a little below your means. And each one of us can live a little below our means. Smiles gave you a lot of examples of how you can save in 1,000 little things, and how those savings, capitalized, gives you more money. €1 at a nominal interest rate for 40 years is 250. If you invest €1 at compound interest, after 40 to 45 years you have 250. If you can save it. The problem is our vision of time, that we have myopia or a time preference for the short term and not for the long term. Therefore, societies that think about retirement pensions, who have a long-term time preference. For example, 1/3 of the kids in the German mini-job, that is, people who earn 400 to 500 euros, have a pension plan. Of course, and then we must explain, why is Germany rich? Because Germans do these things. Their youth has those habits. They stop spending and put them in pension plans at the age of 20, something that is unthinkable here. But that sum, when those kids are old, will be a high fortune, because it is capitalized at a compound interest over a long time. But that's what we must learn. We must know that. Why aren't we as rich as other countries? Well, we must also see what our savings culture is. What is our spending culture? What is our living standard? All of us can live below our means. Under the economical point of view, it seems to me that the topic is quite settled for a long time. I would say 2 centuries now. But from a cultural point of view, I think you're seeing precisely where the problem is. The problem is a cultural resistance against capitalism, and I think that's the approach this speech has missed. Capitalism, in the end, is telling you that there are many behaviors that are not going to lead to prosperity. If people want to be rich, they are going to have to adopt certain behaviors. I would like you to give me a bibliography on communists who talk about this on the sociological level, on the moral level, and say, this is how it is, and if you don't want to, you will be poor, because this is science. When it is often said that the economy is a discipline of moral science, it seems indisputable to me. Because people have a range of possibilities, but some of them are going to make them poorer. That is explained very well by a man named Edward Banfield, The Unheavenly City. He explains social classes and the vision of wealth regarding their time preference. That is, he explains social classes and wealth in relation to time. I'm not a moralist. That is, I don't give moral lessons. Each one of us has the right to live life the way they want. I mean, I don't get involved in anyone's life. Now, you are absolutely right. There are behaviors, I'm not going to mention which ones, because if I do, it would look like I am preaching about morality. There are behaviors that lead to wealth, there are behaviors that lead to stagnation, and there are behaviors that lead directly to poverty. And they are cultural values. That's why I never get tired of talking about the people who win the lottery. Or think, for example, of footballers. Think, for example, of these young people who earn huge sums of money, and that fortune lasts a short time. You have plenty of examples of people who have a huge fortune, and they don't know how to manage it. They want to have more. So they invest their money in a bad way, or they invest randomly, or invest hastily, because they don't have a culture to handle it. On the other hand, some people who are born poor, they never had luck like that, and they became rich, because it is a vision of time. Don't you see the legendary footballers? They have fortunes. I have friends who are tax advisors, who are lawyers and tax advisors to footballers. They say that bills arrive for 30,000 euros a month for clothes, for example. They spend money on cars and break them. They ruin cars worth 100,000 or 60,000 euros. I mean, those kinds of fortunes. Of course, the season ends and they say they need to ask for loans, with salaries from €500,000 up to €1,000,000. Professional footballers. And why? Do they have any money? Yes. Are they poor? Why are they poor after a while? Because they don't have that vision of depriving themselves of the principal amount. They say, we are young, we are going to live life, let's enjoy, carpe diem, let's live life. This attitude systematically leads to poverty. But I repeat, I am not criticizing them. This is a question of each person's morality. I am not a moralist. Now, I know that if you do certain things, you are going to end up poor. I know that if you do certain things, you will end up rich, or relatively rich. You spoke before about the old Galicians. Marx's son-in-law, the right to laziness. The fact that the richest man in the world is Galician, the Spanish Warren Buffett, for me, is Galician. Does it have anything to do with it? Our culture, like many European ones, was a thrifty culture. I always give the same example. Can you imagine your grandfather or your grandmother selling some land? Many of you have grandparents who are landowners. Can you imagine your grandfather, your grandmother, your elders selling land to go on vacation to Punta Cana? Can you imagine them? But I do think you might do it. That's the difference. The old people accumulated land to have more livestock, to have more production. They always lived below their means. They didn't spend much, and little by little, they built this country. You are still young boys and girls, so you couldn't build much, but you will build tomorrow. Because of your age, you haven't built anything yet. But you were born in concrete buildings, you were born in hospitals, you had cars, electricity, gas, food, all that. Who built all that? Those old people who perhaps you think they are backward or you look down on them. They are the ones who built this. They built it with hard savings and working like beasts. Saving to capitalize our society. And we owe all of this to them. And I include myself in owing it to them. I always thanked those old men from before for how they worked. You all saw how your grandparents worked, how they got up, how they didn't spend, everything, day after day, day after day, day after day. That's how this country grew, not from the air. Why do you refer to Marxism as something imperialist, when already at the end of his life, Marx, in his own writings, rejects the idea that revolution has to arrive in an industrial country? Revolutions occurred in Cuba and Russia. Yes, I agree with that. But Marx was wrong. As you know, Volume 2 and Volume 3 of Capital, he did not publish them while he was alive. The second volume was published by Engels, and the third is said to have been Kautsky. Marx's thesis, which I think you know well, what it implies is that capitalism would be a result of an evolution, a dialectical evolution, that there would be several class struggles that would lead to a concentration of capital means. It would lead to impoverishment of the working class. Production would centralize. Then communism would arrive by itself. But for this communism to arrive in an evolutionary way, a prior evolution of society is necessary. It must be a capitalist society. If you read Marx, which it seems you did, Marx defended capitalism quite a bit. He thought it was an unfair system, but he defended it in the sense that it was a progressive force. It is seen, for example, in Capital when he says that capital tore down the Chinese wall. All those things that he says it allowed to advance. And he said that socialism would come as an evolution of capitalism, an evolution with its laws of movement, and from there, socialism would come. Some of Marx's writings on the colonial topic are not in his main works, in their main books. They are in letters, he writes. He points out the idea that he defends colonialism in India, although he criticizes that they cut off people's thumbs and things like that. He defends capitalism as a progressive force because it is the only way for socialism to come to India. Because if socialism derives from capitalism, first, capitalism will have to be established in India. And the way to bring capitalism to India is with imperialism. There is only one book called Colonialism and Classical Economics by Carlos Rodriguez Braun that explains all these doctrines of Marx. It is not incoherent. Marx is being coherent there. And Marx, for example, in letters, mocks Russia and says that there will never be anything there. In fact, the surprise is that it occurred in Russia. And Russia was a revolution, totally contrary to what Marx said, because it was a voluntarist revolution. It was not the result of evolution, but it was the result of a revolution made by them. That's what I mean. But, on the other hand, classical liberals were always radically anti-colonial, basically because colonialism is an aggression, and it is absolutely unworthy. These values that you are commenting on, which are the basis of prosperity, if we young people abandon them, and I believe we are largely abandoning them, could it be that from now on we are going downhill? The countries, just as they are capitalized, they become decapitalized. And there were abundant historical examples of countries that disinherited. They disinherited in the sense that, decapitalized, they became increasingly poorer. Argentina and Uruguay are clear examples. From being the richest countries in the world, they entered a slow decline until they became impoverished. On the one hand, there are factors that decapitalize societies, like this thing I'm talking about, culture and things like that. But there are factors that capitalize. Companies capitalize. We live in relatively stable countries. It is not foreseeable that you will arrive home this afternoon and a horde of Vikings burn your house down, or your people. No, but in the Middle Ages, or in Santiago de Compostela, where we live now, 1,000 years ago, Almanzor would arrive, he'd catch you all, he'd put you to work in the mines, and he'd sell women to the harems of Cairo. And that used to happen. You'd come home, and Almanzor would arrive, or any Moor, or any Viking. We still have the wall in Santiago, the wall of Cresconius, which was a wall built by Bishop Cresconius II for when the Vikings came to plunder us. The Tower of the West and Katoira are there for this reason. They looted, they killed. They Vikings killed the Bishop of Compostela. So, in a society where when we get home and any Viking, any Muslim, any Saracen, any Turk, anything like that, burns our house down, that kidnaps us, we'd have little incentive to save. If we also add that we are going to live only 25 years, we are going to die of a plague, we have little incentive to save. Your life expectancy, probably, will be more than 100 years, because you will have the medicine of 80 years from now when you are old, not today's. So those factors lead to save money as well. They lead you to capitalize. Capitalist values surge in Confucian societies like China, but above all, the most conservative societies like Taiwan or Singapore that are of Confucian culture, of a savings culture, of a family culture, that had a brutal savings culture. They do not have social security systems, pension schemes like ours, but each Chinese person saves his own pension, and they are long-term forecast systems. That is, we perhaps can decline, but this system is not going to fall as long as people who save, like the Chinese people, exist. And from those Chinese towns, we can live and take things out. We can take advantage of them and capitalize us too. I think you come into contradiction. At the beginning, you said that to achieve wealth and prosperity, we must save. You say that it is better to work 10 hours than 9 hours, to get 10 coconuts instead of 9. But then you said, why are we going to save coal if we'll have oil tomorrow? Can you imagine Robinson, instead of working to get 10 coconuts, he works to get 20 coconuts, and a year later, a new kind of food appears that is valid for something else, and coconuts are then worthless.
Por eso es importante el capitalismo. Y para eso están los mercados de futuros.
That's why capitalism is important, and that's what futures markets are for. Robinson makes a calculation in kind, therefore it does not have the information that you may have. You open a newspaper now, cheap, like this one. You look at the back pages and you see the futures markets there. It's telling you which metals are discounted in the future, which are going to be scarcer and which are not. I said that you must consume the charcoal you need at all times. What Jevons said, what the economists said, for example, from the Club of Rome, is that we have to force you to consume less carbon, force you to be cold. And I'm not in favour of that either. The decision to save should be yours. It doesn't have to be forced. What Jevons defends is that there be laws, taxes, policies, or prohibitions that prevent you from consuming charcoal. I mean, you know how much you must consume, and sometimes you must save and sometimes you don't. Maybe you're sick, you must consume coal to keep you warm if you are sick. But it's you who must decide that. What I'm saying is that they forcefully want to prohibit you from using the resources you have now to save them for the future, and the future will probably be much more abundant than today. It's not contradictory, it's only apparently contradictory, in my opinion. You can now be saving €1. If you use compound interest, in mathematical terms it will be 240. Whether it is worth it or not, that depends on the inflation rate. It could be, but maybe not. You also have one thing. If we are rich, it is also because things cost less, not more. In the free market, although it may seem strange, most good prices have gone down dramatically in recent years. So, with every euro, every hour of work, you can buy more things than before. For example, electronics, a computer, in real and absolute terms, it's worth infinitely less now than when I bought the first one. The first computer that I bought, which was at your age, cost me €3,000. €3,000 of that time. And today, an infinitely more powerful computer, €300 or €400, 10 times less expensive and perhaps 10,000 times more powerful.